Thank you. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm delighted to be able to comment here on the significance of biodiversity for the eradication of poverty. Those of you who were here yesterday would have heard our Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, say that biodiversity is a significant part of the GDP of the poor, much more significant than that of GDP itself. And in fact, he was mentioning one of the key results, one of the key findings of the TEEB study called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. The GDP of the poor is important because it is income in the hands of the poor that we have to focus on. And our study found that, to our best estimates, the value that nature delivers to the poor is huge. After all, if you lose nature, then it is the poor farmer whose fields suffer from a lack of nutrients and fresh water. It is the poor farmer's wife who cannot go and collect fuel wood from the forests. And it is the poor farmer's cattle and goats who cannot go and feed on the leaf litter in the forest. And when you start accounting for the value of these invisible and unaccounted services which do not enter GDP, then you understand the nature of the livelihoods of the poor. In the TEEB report, we did this study, and our best estimates for India, for Indonesia, and for Brazil, respectively for poor, rural, and forest-dependent populations of 350 million in India, of 100 million in Indonesia, and 20 million in Brazil, were that the household incomes of these households were around 45% dependent on nature in India, 75% for the 100 million people in Indonesia, and 89%, our best estimate, for the 20 million forest dependents in Brazil. So this is truly, ladies and gentlemen, an important finding endorsed yesterday by the Prime Minister himself, and I think it underlies the understanding that we must have for biodiversity, which is that biodiversity is not merely a luxury for the rich, it is a necessity for the poor. The second point I will make to you comes from the work that has been done from the United Nations Environment Programme and its efforts on the green economy, where we explored the connection between the value that the small farmer gets from nature and the role of the small farm towards poverty eradication. Today, there are more than 525 million farms around the world. Today, something like 400 million of those farms are truly less than 2 hectares. That means basically they are subsistence farms. The farmers on those lands grow at huge risk because of climate variations, because of the difficulties of small farms. They grow at huge risk for their own families and for the local market, for the community market. Their lives are really the focus of this point. And the point here is very simple, which is that if we can introduce ecologically friendly farming methods, there is enormous evidence that this actually improves the overall yield for the small farmer. A study was done by Julius Pretty, an agricultural scientist, and others, and another study was done by the Food and Agricultural Organization, which we have quoted. And these studies show, for instance, in the case of the Julius Pretty study, which is bigger, which covers several million farms across 57 developing countries in more than 280 ecologically friendly farming projects, so-called sustainable farming projects. It shows that the yield went up 79% on average by converting from the traditional, more fertilizer and pesticide-intensive form of farming to a method of farming which made much more use of natural and ecologically friendly approaches, such as reusing farm water, using farm manure, recycling on the farm itself, rotating crops, using different variations of the crop species to prevent losses to pests, and so on. And these are common sense methods which are there available with the farmers, but we do not do enough today to help them use methods like this. Instead, we provide subsidies for pesticides and fertilizers, which have negative impacts on human health and which also deplete the soil quality over time and therefore reduce the amount of yield and in fact add to the need for even more fertilizers and pesticides. So we need a change in thinking here, and it has been always a challenge in India to increase farm yields, and it continues to be. Even 4% yields have been found to be a challenge. On the other side, we can see clearly that across a very large number of farms, almost 3% of the total farming area was covered by Julius Pretty's study. we can see from this statistically significant sample that a different kind of farming, sustainable farming, is in fact good for the small farms. Why is this important? Ladies and gentlemen, it's important for two very simple reasons. Because if we can grow 79% more in the lands of the poor, then that is not only a solution to poverty, it is also a solution to hunger. And hunger and poverty are the two most important problems that we face today. This is completely connected with sustainable farming, and that is why I think we need to look at these methods. So when we talk about ecologically friendly and kinds of farming which have less damage to the environment, less damage to biodiversity and ecosystems, in fact, we are not just talking again about only biodiversity and species and so on. We are talking about wealth in the hands of the poor. Finally, I'll conclude by agreeing with my colleague Rachel Kite from the World Bank that it is really important to look at different ways of measuring wealth. And the project WAVES, which she is leading now at the World Bank, is doing that. Inclusive wealth and looking at capital in its many forms, natural capital, social capital, and human capital, and especially focusing on natural capital as the biggest development asset in developing countries is vital. You cannot manage what you do not measure. And unfortunately, our accounts across all nations, including India's accounts, use a current system of national accounts which does not reflect the value of ecosystem services, nor reflect the loss of this value when we lose forests, when we lose wetlands, when we lose the quality of fresh water. So we are not measuring what we manage, and that is an error. We need to correct this. We need to move towards green accounts or inclusive wealth accounts, and we need to start accounting for national wealth. Before Rio, where there was a declaration signed by many countries and companies to support this, in Africa, I was privileged to attend a meeting in Gaborone, which is the capital of Botswana, where 10 African nations at the head of state level signed off a declaration for natural capital, supported by all of us. And I think it was a heartening feeling to understand and hear from the prime ministers and presidents who were present there in Gaborone their own appreciation of natural capital as a key driver for development in their countries. Ladies and gentlemen, in India here, we have more people dependent on nature, dependent on forests and fresh water and a healthy ecology than we have in the countries in the 10 nations of Africa. Therefore, I think this is absolutely critical for us here as well. I think this is an important point that we should take away from this conference here in Hyderabad, that once again, as I repeat, biodiversity is not merely a luxury for the rich, it is a necessity for the poor. Thank you.